I'm going to talk probably less about co-design. It'll be in there, but I will talk about more the role of design as a form of inquiry, and maybe more actually within an activist kind of context. In a way, where is this thing? So in Public Works, we've been doing kind of participatory design and within the arts and architecture and other design forms for 20 years. And at one point, we were thinking, okay, so what? You know, I was kind of thinking, okay, so we do all these participatory stuff, but how does it go to the next stage? How does it actually become empowering? How do we get social mobility and not just this kind of model where it almost becomes this, and not that there's anything wrong with participation, but are we just extracting ideas? And so we started to become quite critical. So this is one of the very, very early projects in 2000 where, so talking about design intervention, really not to test kind of solutions to a defined or a possible problem, but to enable new forms of experiences, politics, dialogue, social dynamics, and even problems to emerge in a way in this kind of complex world. And the Mobile Porch was this kind of multifunctional furniture scale object that rolled underneath the Westway in Kensington, and it could be all sorts of configurations. And everywhere it went, it kind of had its own community to activate it in a way. Some of them we activated, some of it was just a space for others to use. And interestingly, the moment you have a space in another kind of space, then that becomes quite a free space from all the regulations of that other space. So it became really interesting that it became a space of freedom in a way in an otherwise quite institutional space of the public realm. And then I suppose as my background as an architect, I decided very early on that I didn't want to engage in that. And that actually this land as a depletable resource is actually something that we have to be critically aware of not enclosing continuously through privatization, which is why I'm probably interested in the master's course I've written on the commons. So this is just some of the statistics that was actually it was in 2019, it was written in The Guardian. But I suppose what happens with this, first of all, I don't know if you guys know, but David Harvey, who talks about the right to the city and the fact that if the right to the city is a right that actually we don't even realize is taken from us because it just is, and it's normalized. But then what happens when land privatization moves from public to private sector, socially key users and services start to disappear. And we today have government's land disposal strategy, and it is called that. It is called public land disposal strategy, quite shamelessly. So if we are thinking about land as a public asset, what is the role of design as a method that we can develop tactics, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to save land as our common asset. So one tactic is occupation of that land, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But then there is designing events in that land that you've occupied as a way to mobilize social capital and mobilize a community and bring a community together to steward and protect that piece of land. Then you, of course, design the intervention to occupy that piece of land and design both tangible and intangible learning ecosystems to sustain it. So by that, I mean that, just because you bring communities together doesn't mean they know how to collaborate, how to work together, how to listen, how not to play power games, and so on and so forth. So there is an entire learning ecosystem that needs to go around this. And also, we are in a very individualist, neoliberal context where it's all about individualism and not collectivism. So then there is a completely different set of normalized understanding of collective and individual ownership or even working together that you have to somehow surpass. And all of this takes a lot of time because you're going against the system, but it's worth it. So this is, and we've got, I mean, at the moment we have, how many? We have about 6 sites that we've occupied legally. They're all legal. Some of them have become permanent architectural objects, like Loughborough Farm and LJ Works in Loughborough Junction. This is one that I've been involved in, which was a tiny site owned by Clarion Housing Association. And temporary architecture is brilliant because it's not so threatening. So if you so I negotiated for 3 years to occupy this little piece of land with a temporary piece of architecture. This whole structure cost us about $6,000, and with my students at the CAS, and so then it's a bit like Occupy, but in design. And then through that, we started to run lots and lots of events to build what I called social capital. And these words I'm using because those are the words I'm using within the institutions of power to kind of do this trickery that I've just learned about. So it's really important to decenter the object from what it is to what it does. To where its agency is. So move the object from a commodity to a political artifact with agency, and design both tangible and intangible learning ecosystems required to sustain this opposing ideology, which I just talked about. And all of these, the designing of the events, the designing of the learning ecosystem, the designing of the artifact, the designing of the pieces I'm going to show with the documentation of evidence, all of this for me is an entire strategic packaging of the tactics with which we operate. And the fund, and it's not, I'm not doing this for free. So it's just that the funding comes from lots of different then areas, okay? So I'm kind of really interested in how these artifacts then become disobedient objects. And so this is Catherine Flood and Gavin Grindon when they curated the V&A show, or maybe they didn't create it, but they wrote the book on the disobedient objects, and they said evocative propositions or an invitation that these objects are evocative propositions or an invitation rather than a typology or a closed concept. And that these objects are both tactical and strategic and are constantly in flux and constantly evolving. And that is really, really important, how you keep that going. Their success and failure is ultimately based on the change they make and not necessarily their form. So I already talked about that. I won't talk about it again. So one really interesting thing is, again, with the room I showed before, which is called the common room. So from this moment of us designing all these events, and there is a really interesting concept of designing of events from the anthropologist Don Handelman, where he talks about models and not mirrors. So you don't mirror a status quo, but you create new forms of events that actually starts to tactically deal with change. And now, however, what is really interesting is that most of that, apart from one, is actually being hosted by local residents and local community. So the relationship has shifted now from us programming the space to others programming the space as a free open space for whatever they want to do, apart from it kind of being commercial. And then evidencing of this kind of social and cultural capital. So that's really interesting because that evidence, we're living in an economic environment that everything has to be kind of calculated and measured and evidenced and all of that. So let's play with that. So this document is really evidencing all of that kind of wealth, which is social wealth that the site has created. And because of that, Clarion Housing have now commissioned us to do a feasibility study to turn that into a permanent building with a peppercorn lease forever for the community to have. So for us, architecture, the permanent architecture happens at a point where we've claimed that piece of land as a kind of asset for the community. And also designing the governance of disobedience. So how do you? So there are kind of these. I won't go into it because I won't have time. But there is kind of dynamic models of governance called sociocracy, for example, or constitutions such as fair shares, which is about democratic models of governance where everybody, it's a collect. So these are all people who are from different community organizations from where that common room is. So it's all about how are they all part of the governance of that tiny little space rather than one community group kind of having the kind of power. So this is our discussion at the moment about governance and how it could collaboratively be governed. And then finally, this is my final slide in terms of the ethics. So I struggled in academia for ages thinking this is just the kind of conventional binary of ethics of, you have a duty of care to this one, like very hierarchical actually as a researcher to your research subject and so on and so forth. And I really struggled with that until I found relational ethics, which is embedded in feminist discourse of care ethics. And it puts the emphasis on the relationship and not the individuals. So that works really well because you are both responsible, or the network is responsible for those relationships to sustain. Otherwise, it kind of just becomes this arduous thing on one person, and the other could actually act unethically, which I had seen. It's not like as if if you're a community group, you're always acting ethically. So then if you're putting it onto that relationship, it becomes really, really interesting. And then it's all highly contextualized and localized. And it's to do with a kind of complexity of situation. So it's very situated, again, as a feminist discourse. And there's kind of this quote, caring is reparative and concerned more with maintaining connectedness rather than separation between people, which current discourse in ethics, I feel, is very separative and very hierarchical. Care about social relations of the networks that can sustain social solidarity than divide with hierarchical positions. And how the object, the design, mediates these set of complex relationships at the scale of the network and at the scale of the one-to-one. And I think that becomes really interesting. In a way, it's like the room, the temporary space becomes this object that starts to negotiate all these relationships that I was talking about, such as the events or the governance or all of those kind of different things. So then it kind of has agency to be involved in the ethics as well. So I think I'll leave it there. And if you're interested in the Masters, do come and talk to me. And thank you very much for listening.